Thanks. Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name is Justine Cross, and I'm a student at Central Queensland University. I'm a medical science student, and I have now just completed my 6-week placement here at the Mater Centre of Neuroscience in the Advanced Epilepsy Unit. So the Advanced Epilepsy Unit was established in July of 2015 and is the largest active epilepsy surgery unit in Australia. And the unit investigates refractory epilepsy, which is where epileptic patients still experience seizures even though they're on medication. So the services offered by the Advanced Epilepsy Unit are public and private routine EEGs. Now these determine the presence of epileptic activity. They are video recorded. Patients can be sleep deprived. The recordings are run from anywhere from 20 minutes up to 3 hours. Provocation techniques such as hyperventilation and photic stimulation are used, and this can also be the beginning of the surgical assessment. Routine EEGs can also be performed for private and public inpatients. So that can be done in the ICU, also in the public and private wards throughout the hospital. So with the routine EEGs, the International 1020 electrode measuring system is used. The unit uses gold cup electrodes, and new prep exfoliating gel is used to clean the skin prior to attaching the electrodes. 1020 conductive wax is used to attach the electrodes to the scalp itself, and the electrodes are attached to a 32-channel junction box, which is then connected to the Nihon Koden software program. In the unit, they also offer video EEGs. So again, the International 1020 measuring system is used, though this time the electrodes are actually glued to the scalp using a collodion adhesive. To ensure that there is conduction into the electrodes, a synapse fluid is inserted into the electrodes. Also, if a mesial temporal epilepsy is suspected, sphenoidal electrodes can also be used. Now these are inserted into the cheek, so they are inserted between the mandible and the zygomatic arch and sit just underneath the sphenoidal bone. The electrodes are then attached to a 64-channel junction box, and these recordings can be from anywhere from 24 hours up to 5 days, just depending on the patient and then how many seizures are recorded within that time. Provocation techniques are also used. So if a focal epilepsy is suspected, then sleep deprivation and medication reduction. And if a genetic generalized or functional disorder is suspected, hyperventilation and photic stimulation is used. And while the patients are admitted for video monitoring, they are continually monitored by either a scientist or a nurse. Okay, also at the unit, a stereotactic EEGs are also conducted. So this is an invasive process. So tailored implantation plans are specifically built for each patient, just depending on where it is thought that the epilepsy is arising from. So the implantation process is using ROSA, the robot, conducting a 3D workup based off an MRI and information put into the ROSA software, and the software plans a trajectory and depth to the target. The patients do stay in the unit until an adequate amount of seizures have been recorded. So this can be a week or up to 3 weeks. It again depends on the patient. And there is a maximum of 256 contacts used in stereotactic EEG. So as you can see here on the silver bits here, they're all the contact points. So there can be a maximum of 256 of those in a stereotactic EEG. Okay, so as I did mention, for a surgical candidate, patients will have refractory focal epilepsy. So again, this is where patients are still experiencing seizures, even though they are on medication. So they would have tried multiple medications and failed these, and also tried a number of medication variations. So the patient is referred to an epileptologist here at the Mater Hospital by their neurologist, and then the epileptologist will have a consultation and conduct a workup, then to determine if the patient is able to have, or is a candidate, for surgery. Okay, so the testing process, there's a number of tests involved. So phase 1 is a video EEG, an MRI, and also a PET scan. Phase 1.5 is a SPECT and a WADA, though a WADA is not very commonly used. And then phase 2, given that the MRI is non-lesional, is the stereotactic EEG. So given the results of all of these tests, we'll then determine if the patient is a surgical candidate or not. So if the patient is a surgical candidate, they can have this epileptogenic zone resected. This also, though, depends on the location of that zone and also how close it is to eloquent areas such as speech and motor. If the patient is unable to have surgery or elects not to have surgery, some other options are available, which is gamma knife surgery, vagus nerve stimulation, and also the ketogenic diet. Okay, so while I have been here in the Advanced Epilepsy Unit, I've come across a number of very interesting epilepsy cases, and I will go through and discuss one of those with you now. Okay, so this patient experienced faints as a child, and these also included auras. And the auras occurred throughout childhood into their teenage years, occurring roughly once a year. And the patient experienced their first generalised tonic-clonic in their mid-20s, and at the time was currently taking zonisamide and lamotrigine anti-epileptic medication. So the semiology of the auras, this was stereotyped and lasts 30 seconds. The patient described it as a light switching on in their head. The patient also had a vague awareness, a vague memory and familiarity of a situation and feels disconnected from themselves. The patient also had a subtle loss of awareness. There was no overt autonomic features, and the patient also feels fatigued, has word finding difficulties, and is unable to talk following the auras. So the partial seizure, so in addition to the aura, the patient's partner notes that the patient has a blank look and covers their face during the seizure. The patient experiences mouth chewing, automatisms, repetitive swallowing, The patient also has right arm dystonia followed by leg extension. The patient has experienced over 10 generalised tonic-clonic seizures since they've been having seizures, and these have gradually gotten worse over the past 12 months. So in that time, the patient did experience 2 daytime generalised tonic-clonic seizures, as well as 4 auras, and they occurred in the space of 2 weeks. The patient also has a precipitant of stress. Okay, so the testing process. The patient did have a sleep-deprived EEG through a private clinic, not at the Mater, which noted left temporal changes. So the patient had an MRI here at the Mater, which was originally noted as normal, though after a review following the video EEG, it did note or suggested some possible subclinical mesial temporal sclerosis on the left. The patient had a PET scan, which noted a mesial temporal hypometabolism. The patient also had a 5-day video EEG, which is the 1020 electrode system, and also sphenoidal electrodes. And the patient had a stereotactic EEG with 7 electrodes inserted into the cortex. Okay, so the video EEG findings. So interictal, there was intermittent rhythmic slowing in the left temporal region, and also regional left temporal sharp waves, which were maximal at F7 and then that moved to SP1 and T7. And for the ictal, all of the patient's seizure types were recorded, including auras, partial seizure, and a partial seizure with secondary generalisation. And all of those seizures had an onset in regional left temporal. Okay, so the patient did have a stereotactic EEG with 7 electrodes inserted, and this here is a picture of the brain map of where they were all inserted. So the temporal pole, amygdala, hippocampus, posterior cingulate, anterior insular, orbitofrontal, and basal temporal were all areas of the cortex that were inserted and had contact points of the electrodes. And this is a graph of all of the areas that had contact points. So the electrodes range from having 8, 10 and 15 contact points for each electrode, and this just notes, so where the area was suspected of coming from had quite a number of contact points. So for the amygdala and the hippocampus, all the temporal areas. Okay, so the stereotactic interictal findings. So there was some non-epilepsy form discharges found. So there was focal continuous slowing of the left temporal pole and hippocampus. There was intermittent rhythmic slowing of the left temporal pole, and also focal intermittent rhythmic slowing of the middle temporal gyrus. And also I'd just like to note this is not a picture of the patient himself, but this is pretty much the workup of what it looks like after an SEEG. That's what the electrodes look like once they're inserted. Okay, and the SEEG epilepsy form discharges. So the most common discharge that was found was focal spiking in the left mesial temporal pole. There's also focal spikes in the left hippocampus, and the spikes network synchronization with the hippocampus, temporal pole, middle short gyrus of anterior insula, the parahippocampal gyrus, frontal operculum, and the posterior cingulate. There's also focal spiking of the left anterior insula, although these were independent and infrequent. Okay, so during the SEEG, all the patients' seizure types were recorded. There was 3 new clinical signs. There was 1 aura, there was 3 partial seizures, and there was also 1 partial seizure with the secondary generalization. And all of these seizures had an EEG onset of the left hippocampus. Okay, so the ictal findings. So as I mentioned, the seizures began with spikes in the left hippocampus, which synchronized with the left amygdala. Throughout the aura seizures, these areas also synchronized with the left anterior insula, the posterior cingulate, and the fusiform gyrus. And then in the partial seizures, there was more areas involved, including the anterior insula, left posterior cingulate, the parahippocampal gyrus, also the orbitofrontal region, and the frontal operculum. Okay, so this here is the SEEG, and noted is where the EEG onset is in the hippocampus, which then synchronizes with the amygdala. I know it's not a fantastic picture, but essentially that's what it looks like. Okay, so the patient also went through some cortical stimulation. So cortical stimulation is done for pre-surgical mapping of the functional areas of the cortex. So the stimulation is performed to mimic any seizure semiology. So stimulation is at 25 Hertz for 3 seconds, and a current is run through the depth electrodes to each contact at increasing intensities. And this data is then used to either confirm or alter the thesis on where the epilepsy is originating from and then spreading to. Okay, so after discharges and symptoms arose from the left hippocampus and the amygdala. So when B prime was stimulated, there were some after discharges. There was a sensation of an aura. The patient also felt clinically disconnected and very fatigued. So this is also very common in his seizures. Stimulation also produced in the, so that was the hippocampus. In the amygdala, it was produced symptoms of smell and taste that were very familiar to seizures. Also a reduced energy level and also the tightness in the throat, which again were very common to the patient's seizures. It's also very important to note that there was no after discharges or symptoms that arose from stimulation of the insula or the operculum. Okay. So the evaluation and outcome after all of the tests. So as I've already mentioned, all the seizures did originate from the left hippocampus that then synchronized with the left amygdala. The seizures spread throughout the anterior temporal lobe, involving the temporal pole, parahippocampal gyrus, and the fusiform. These test results are also consistent with the PET scan, which did show the hypermetabolism in the anterior temporal region. With the cortical stimulation, the patient's semiology could be reproduced when stimulating the hippocampus, the amygdala, the parahippocampal gyrus, fusiform, and the temporal pole. That indicates that these areas can be resected. And it is important to note that when the frontal operculum and the anterior insula were stimulated, they didn't have any of the after discharges, meaning that these areas could be spared in a resection because they are not affected by the area. Okay, so the treatment. So the patient was determined to be a really good candidate for a left anterior temporal pole lobectomy, given that the onset was in the left hippocampus and amygdala, and the irritative zone was the anterior temporal area, anterior temporal lobe. So just in the circle here is roughly the area that was resected, so from the temporal pole 4 centimetres back. And the patient did agree to surgery, which was then conducted in February of this year, 2017. So I do have a quality improvement as well. So in the unit, when there is an SEEG or a video EEG, there are nurses that are assigned to the unit. Though a number of the nurses don't feel confident in recognising the beginning of a seizure based on the EEG alone. And also some of the nurses are unaware of what is seizure activity and what is artefact. Okay, nurses do receive a handover at the beginning of their shift. They give one at the end, and they note if there was any semiology, the patient's care, and the time of the patient's last seizure. But they don't receive any handovers from the scientists themselves. So each patient does have different EEG onset. So this can be, it's very patient specific. So there's nothing handed over to the nurses on what to actually look for. Okay, so the proposed improvement is that the scientists provide the nurses with a patient-specific handover. So these would include a note of where the seizures could begin. So whether this is going to be in specific leads, depending on the epilepsy, or whether it will be over all of the leads. Also a printout of the patient's EEG onset. This is also given that the patient has actually had a seizure. So as soon as they do have one, that can be printed out and highlighted and given to the nurses so they do know what to look for when the next seizure may occur. and also if there is a projected possibility of the patients having seizures. So they might be somebody that will have a seizure quite frequently or very soon after reducing medications, and they may take 4 or 5 days potentially to have a seizure. Okay. In addition to that would be compulsory education sessions. So Isaac already does run the seizure management education session, though not every nurse that is assigned to the unit has actually gone through that training. So I do think that this training should be made compulsory while the nurses are in the unit. And also just a basic EEG interpretation education session, just noting things like artifact, epileptic activity, and some seizure onset, just noting the difference between a normal EEG and this seizure. Okay, so in conclusion, the Advanced Epilepsy Unit investigates refractory epilepsy patients that could be good surgical candidates. And they offer routine EEG services to the hospital, and they have a high level of neurological diagnostic services for surgical workup. Thanks.